Hey, good evening, Crossview. Just wanted to share with you a little devotion from Genesis 22. If you've been a Christian for very long, you'll probably recognize the chapter. Abraham is being tested by God. God tells him to sacrifice his son Isaac. And so I think there are some wonderful things we can learn from this chapter, especially how to deal with some of the trials that come to us in our life. So let me begin just simply by reading the first couple of verses. Genesis chapter 22. In verse 1, it says, "Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. He said, Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you." One of the things that just kind of really jumps out to me, or jumps out at me when I read those two verses, is in verse 1 where it says, God tested Abraham. So here's Abraham. He's 100 years, well, he's actually over 100 years old, and he's still being tested by God. I think that may get the attitude that once we get to be a certain age, or after we've been a Christian for so long, that we don't go through these tests anymore. That you know, maybe we've arrived. But I mean, here is Abraham, the man of faith, who is almost at the end of his life, and yet God is giving him the greatest test he's going to face in his life. And so we never grow too old to be tested. We never grow too old to learn. So don't get that attitude in your mind. When we stop learning, we stop growing. When we stop growing, we stop living. And so we see Abraham being tested here. Now, Genesis 22, like I said, records the greatest test in Abraham's life. And it can teach us some principles in how to handle some of the tests that we face in our life. So one principle is expect tests to come, and specifically from God, because that's what verse 1 tells us. This is a test from God. So you can expect that in your life as well. You know, as you grow in faith, that's the only way you're going to grow in faith, is if your faith is tested. So God is going to do that from time to time. So Abraham, he's had his share of test. For the moment God called him out of his country of Ur, that was a test. God told him to go to a land he'd never seen. That was a test. When he got to that land, there was a famine. That was a test. God promised a son for years and years and years before he came, and that was a test. And now he's facing this one, the greatest one of all. So Abraham has had his share for sure. Now, not every difficulty that we face in life, I think this is important to know, not every difficulty we face in life is a test from God. I think many times we may think it is, but it's not. A lot of times, some of the difficulties that we have in our life, in our lives, is brought on by ourselves. Bad decisions, sinful actions, disobedience. And it's because of those bad decisions we're going through difficulties, not necessarily because God is sending a test. So that's important to understand. And it's also important to understand the difference between a temptation and a test. Those are two totally different things. Temptations come from our desires within. Trials come from God, and there's a purpose. God has a purpose, an eternal purpose with these trials. Temptations, the devil uses temptations to bring out the worst in us. God uses trials to bring out the best in us. And another big difference between the two is temptations always seem logical. That's why temptations are temptations. You know, it seems like a logical thing many times. Tests, on the other hand, don't always seem very logical. That's why they're a test. Think about this one that God is testing Abraham with. I mean, what's logical about God finally giving Abraham his son, who's supposed to fulfill this covenant, and then turning right around and asking him to kill his son? So it's important to understand those differences. So the first principle is expect tests from God. A second principle that I think we can expect from God is focus, when we're going through the trials, focus on the promises of God. Not just trying to find out an explanation of why you're going through it. That'll drive you crazy. Focus on the promises of God. I like this quote that I found. It says, our faith is not really tested until God asks us to bear what seems unbearable, do what seems unreasonable, and expect what seems impossible. It reminds me of another quote that I read one time, and it says it says, a faith that has not been tested, or a faith that can't be tested, can't be trusted. You know, a lot of us want to talk about how, oh, I've got faith. I'm a Christian and I have faith. And then when we go through something difficult in life, we lose our faith. So what good is your faith until it's been tested, until it's been tried? And so that's the whole point. And that's the reason why God allows testing in our life. Now, I want you to consider how unreasonable this test is in Abraham's life. Isaac was Abraham's one and only son. He's the future of the covenant that God made with him. Isaac is the miracle child. He's the gift of God to Abraham and Sarah because of their faith. And Abraham and Sarah have pretty much built and lived their life and their future around their son Isaac. And so God is now asking Abraham to give his son, to sacrifice his son. So he's testing Abraham's faith, his hope. He's testing his love. It's like God is asking him to wipe out everything that he and Sarah have lived for. You know, when God sends a trial to us, our first response is usually, why, Lord? I'm guilty of that. Our second response is usually, why me, Lord? But instead of trying to find an explanation, we need to be leaning on the promises of God. We know we know why God has allowed that test in our lives. We know that God doesn't do things without a purpose or a reason. He allows that test to come to your life to purify your faith or your character, to strengthen your faith, or maybe even to keep you from sinning. So you don't have to ask God why or why me. There's always a reason. We just need to remember the promises of God. Now I want to read you a little more of the story, and I want you to see how Abraham is not asking why, but he's going to rely on the promises of God. So verse 3, so Abraham rose early the next morning and saddled his donkey and two of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and he split wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the third day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. Now listen closely, you got to hear this. Verse 5, Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. These are his two young servants. He said, stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go over there. We will worship and return to you. Abraham just told his two servants that we're going to go worship and we will return. Abraham's expecting that he's not going to return by himself, that he's going to return with his son. Verse 6, Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son, and he took in his hand the fire, and in the other hand the knife, and so the two of them walked together. So Abraham is going to do what God's asking him to do, but Abraham also believes he's going to come back with Isaac. Why is that? Well, because Abraham believes in the promise of God. You see, God had promised Abraham that he would fulfill the covenant he made through his son Isaac. And Abraham understood that God's will is never going to contradict God's promises. God's will is never going to contradict God's promises. God had promised Abraham, I'm going to make this covenant with you. Isaac is going to fulfill part of that covenant. So now God's will is for him to go and sacrifice his son, but there's somehow in some way, there's no way that these two things can be a contradiction. So Abraham is like, okay, I'll do it because I know you're going to fulfill your promise somehow, even if you have to raise him from the dead. And we know that he believed that because in Hebrews chapter 11, it tells us that Abraham actually believed that if he sacrificed his son, God would raise him from the dead to fulfill the promise. I think that's an important lesson. Real faith does not demand an explanation. Real faith relies on the promises of God. One more thing. Seek to glorify God. in your trials, in your testing. It's so easy when you're going through a difficult time to only think about your needs, to only think about your burdens, but instead let's focus on bringing glory to God and to Jesus Christ. Many times we find ourselves asking, how do I get out of this? What can I do to get out of this quickly? But instead of asking that, we need to ask ourselves, what can I do, uh, or what can I get out of this that will glorify God? What can I get out of this that will honor the Lord? Sometimes we waste suffering by not honoring God. We waste the suffering by ignoring the opportunities to reveal Jesus Christ to other people who are watching us to see how we respond to these difficulties in our lives. So don't waste it. Maybe you're going through something difficult right now. Don't waste that opportunity. Use it. Use it to glorify Jesus Christ. I think that the greatest thing that can happen when we experience trials that come to us from God is that we grow closer to God and that we become more like Jesus. And that's how we glorify Him. So expect trials to come. Focus on the promise, not the explanation. And try to glorify Jesus Christ in that trial as best you can. I hope to see you soon. God bless you.